Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion video about Lost Ark to answer a question of whether or not this game, this newly released MMORPG, or at least newly released for North America and Europe, is worth your time. People like myself, we've played MMORPGs for years. We've tried to get one good game that we could really sink our teeth into, especially those of us that played WoW in the past, but we've gotten burned again and again and again. Star Wars The Old Republic, Wildstar, Guild Wars 2, and most recently New World. They've all had issues. Is Lost Ark the one game that's actually going to deliver the quality that we've wanted? Well, I can't fully answer it at this particular point because I've only sunk 14 hours into this game, and this is the kind of game where you really need hundreds upon hundreds of hours to really decide if you're going to spend thousands of hours to have dozens if not hundreds of days played in it. But from what I've played so far, things do look promising, even if the start of the game is lackluster to say the least. The story is, in my case, I picked a warrior with the Paladin Advanced class. And my character story was, you're a gladiator, you fought off a demon invasion, now seek the light, save the world, find the Lost Ark, and create the super weapon that is going to defeat chaos and evil. That is the beginning of the game, and it's actually pretty weak, to be honest. The intro cinematic, the initial part, sure. The very first few cinematics and dialogues, sure. But after that, as you go through the tutorial area and then as the world opens up to you, it gets pretty bland and pretty boring and forgettable very quickly. The initial areas of the game, the things you're doing, the quests you're given, they're not great. They're not good at all. The activities are not great. The story isn't great. The characters you're interacting with, the dialogue, all of that, pretty bland, pretty forgettable. The game is introducing more and more mechanics as you go through it, but it really takes about a dozen hours or so for things to really get interesting from a story perspective or from a quest perspective. But those first dozen hours, pretty bland, pretty forgettable. The only reason I push through that is, one, I feel the combat system in itself is pretty fine. It's pretty good, actually. There's a lot of things to consider, a lot of stats, a lot of abilities to use, consumables, etc. And on top of that, the dungeons themselves seemed fairly interesting, even if the quests and the story, not so much. But then I got about a dozen hours or so into the game, and I got to Lutera, and things started getting more interesting. Lutera is in a state of civil war. You take one of the sides, you fight in that civil war, and, well, I think it's best to show you rather than for me to talk about it. And that's about a dozen or so hours into the game. And for the rest of this video, I'm going to be showing you footage past this point. And I can say that things do get significantly more interesting once you do get to Lutera. What I showed you there, that battle in particular, is the culmination of the West Lutera arc. Then you have East Lutera. It's still the same kingdom. You're fighting for the throne of this kingdom, supporting one side. And Lutera Castle itself is the main hub of the game. You get access to your housing, the stronghold, as it's called. You get access to more of the world. And all that. The world does seem massive. So it does have a slow, weak, tedious start in this game. But things do seem to be looking up. As I play more and more of this game, you get access to more systems. There's more things to worry about. There's gathering, there's crafting. There's a lot more things to deal with in the game as you progress through it. It does take a while, about level 30 or so, or close to level 30, to actually get access to all of this. But once you start really going into the open world, once you get access to more and more of the game, things do start escalating. In fact, it can feel fairly overwhelming once you realize just how much it is to it. So maybe that's their intention with the slow, weak start, but early impressions do count, and there are games that there are quite a few other games out there that do take their time to introduce various pieces of gear, mechanics, and all that, but do have a strong start. In fact, I played one quite recently, God of War on PC. Like all the tools, abilities, gear, etc. on God of War, it takes time to unlock them. But even so, even with the start, you do have a very strong start in God of War. You don't have a strong start in Lost Ark. It's fairly weak, it's fairly bland, it's fairly forgettable. If you can get past the first 10, 12 hours of the game, things will improve. The boss fights get better and better. The dungeons get better and better. The story gets more interesting. The cinematics, well, they're pretty solid throughout the entire experience, but they also get better and better. The more I play this game, the more I experience of this title, the more fun I'm having. It does have a weak start, but it does get better. Not necessarily fond of having to spend 10, 12 hours playing a game to get to the good stuff, but hey, it is what it is. There's still a bunch of tedious grinding quests to do. Quests in MMORPG tend to be pretty horrible in many ways, but the combat system certainly works in the game's favor. Now, in terms of other aspects beyond the idea that the game takes some time to get better, but eventually does so. What about other aspects? Well, I've touched on the combat system. I think the flow of combat is nice. I think the way abilities work, how the classes work from what I've seen, that's all fairly well and good. So no complaints there. Plenty of consumables, plenty of complexities to the game. I mean, this really fits the style of game that, oh, it's easy to play but difficult to master. There's a lot of complex abilities. There's boss fights that I've seen so far that would give any World of Warcraft boss certainly a run for their money, or certainly seem comparable to them. So there's a lot of good things in Lost Ark in terms of, but there is one problem that I do have with the combat system. Namely, the controls. And what do I mean by that? Well, the controls feel pretty janky, I'll be honest. Even for a game that's focused on mouse control, so you're controlling your movement through the mouse, your auto attacks are also through the mouse, even by those standards, it feels weird, less responsive than I would like in terms of that. And that's actually a major problem, because you do have boss fights with a lot of AoE abilities that you need to dodge, you have a lot of movement, and it doesn't feel as responsive as it could be. As a comparison, I actually played quite a bit of Diablo 3 in the run-up of Diablo 2 Resurrected, and Diablo 3, and I actually installed Diablo 3 to get a feel for it before I made this video. Diablo 3 felt significantly more responsive. Just how your character acts when you're pressing down your mouse buttons or your keyboard buttons just felt better than this one. I think the issue with Lost Ark in respect to this is, in, say, Diablo 3, if you hold down your left mouse button, if you press it on a certain area, you'll move to that area. It'd be a left or right mouse button. But if you're hovering over an enemy with that button, you will attack that enemy. Now, here's how it works in Lost Ark. You have one mouse button for movement and one mouse button for attacking. And that's a bit of an issue, because it just creates this weird dance where, like, okay, I want to click on an area and I want to move there, so I have to press my left mouse button, but if I want to attack that, I have to press my right mouse button. I don't understand why they can do something more similar to Diablo, where regardless of the button you're pressing, you are attacking, though it is different attacks in Diablo 3. You do have a combo system for your auto attacks, for your standard attacks, if you will, in this game. But yeah, I don't know, it just feels kind of weird. I think the best thing you can do as a player is just use one of the mouse buttons, get used to the idea of you're only going to use one mouse button for the sake of movement, and really do the auto attacks with your keyboard. Still getting used to it, feels less responsive than it could be. In terms of other areas with controls, the key bindings, the things that you can rebind, feel fairly limited. I can't bind the keys the way I want them to. One other aspect could be said that not having WSD movement combined with the mouse movement, of course, not having that kind of movement is an incredibly limiting factor. I understand some people really don't want to see that kind of movement for this kind of game, but I do feel personally that it's a fairly limiting factor for this title. I would like better movement. I like better control, because if I'm gonna have boss fights in this game, end game, that are going to be as complex and difficult as, say, mythic boss fights in World of Warcraft. Maybe not. I don't know. Actually, I'm fairly blind on information with this game. I haven't spent hours and hours and hours digesting information on YouTube or other places about how this game is going to be. I haven't spent that time. I'm just giving you my early impressions, really, after about 14 hours. But if I'm going to have complex boss fights with a great deal of difficulty in the end game, which seems how this game is going to play out, not having the tight control that I'm used to in games like, say, World of Warcraft or Diablo, and yet still expected to deal with those mechanics, is going to be a problem. Because quite frankly, it's not fun to deal with a boss fight where you're struggling just as much with the controls and your movement as you are with the actual mechanics of the boss, let alone the DPS, tanking, and healing requirements that a boss of that nature would entail. So that is one major red flag as far as I see it with this game. The controls could have used more work. In other areas, what about performance? Well, it is an Unreal Engine game, an Unreal Engine free game, so it really should run well, though not necessarily. There's plenty of Unreal Engine free games that run really badly. Just take a look at XCOM 2 as an example, which shouldn't run that badly, but they do. Quite a few games actually do run badly in this engine, but this one does seem to run fairly well. Initially, I had a limit of 60 FPS, but I didn't realize I had set my 75 hertz monitor, set it to 60 hertz in Windows. So anyway, once I moved that, it's running at 75 FPS, seems to run at 75 FPS. I had to use a third-party program to actually get the FPS to show for whatever reason, but when I did that, it was showing me 75 FPS. There are some performance dips, especially if I'm running my computer for too many hours or if I'm running the game for too long, but for the most part, the game runs fairly solid. In terms of performance, the one problem I do have is that there doesn't seem to be a VSync option in the game that I can disable. If I really wanted to be honest, I could go to some of the Unreal Engine files, configuration files that you can find and modify, or some of the base files of the game and modify them to disable VSync. I imagine there's quite a great deal of customization that you can do by just messing around with certain config files in Unreal Engine. I could do that, but it is annoying to not have certain graphical options like VSync as an example, or say an option to disable or enable depth of field. You do have motion blur, thankfully, but some things just seem to be lacking, and that is frustrating as I see it. Performance is fairly stable, but some options are just not there that I would want them to be. And in general, as a game, my impression of it is fairly solid, but there are these troubled spots I reveal. Now, what do I think about the long-term prospects of Lost Ark? Because this is an important question. Is Lost Ark going to do well long-term? Is it a game worth investing this kind of time? Like, it's going to take you 20, 30 hours or so to level up to max, give or take. Probably like 26, something like that, I imagine. Is it the kind of game that you want to spend that kind of time in? Now, to be clear, this is significantly less than it takes to level a character to max level in, say, vanilla World of Warcraft or Burning Crusade Classic or retail World of Warcraft, just as an example. It's significantly less time, but still, it is a significant amount of time that's required to reach the end game. Is it worth it? Well, my perspective on Lost Ark is as follows. It feels good irrespective of these issues. It feels good despite the tedious leveling, the boring ass story until you get about 10 hours in, and it's not like the story changes. It just gets a lot more awesome moments, freaking awesome moments like the castle siege or boss fights like that do feel impactful, do feel great, but the overall story doesn't change. It's just the performances and the characters and the events that were happening were just far worse initially than they end up being. But anyway, what do I feel about the long-term prospects? My perspective on this is it has to be answered with a question. Does Lost Ark have a lot of solid endgame content? If it does, then it is a very promising game that might just end up being the MMORPG many of us that do enjoy endgame raiding or do enjoy dealing with a lot of endgame PvE content have been waiting for years. I know many people talk about fucking PvP, but I want to be very clear. Every MMO, as far as I'm concerned, has failed to be the WoW killer, to be successful, because they didn't have endgame PvE content that people could do, that people could really sink their teeth into. PvP can be an important aspect of a game, but it isn't the only thing, especially for a game like this. From my point of view, if Lost Ark does have solid PvE content, if it does have great raids, if it has great dungeons, and so far the dungeons that I've encountered are good, to be clear. Even if I only hope that they're leveling dungeons, because I'm not sure I would want to do them over and over again in endgame. But if these dungeons are only leveling dungeons and we have a completely different set of them at the endgame specifically designed for that, with awesome boss fights, with a lot of things to deal with, then it's going to be a successful game. If not, if the answer is no, or if we are just reusing dungeons, reusing things, doing the same things over and over again, the answer might not be yes. It might be no. It might have a short shelf life, but we shall see about that. Final comment I'll make, I feel the developers released way too few servers for this game. This is something I've seen MMORPGs do again and again and again with releases. Hell, it's something I've seen even Blizzard do with Classic, even though they should know better. Because they have such a rich history with releasing expansions and versions of World of Warcraft in general. But one of the common themes I'm seeing with MMORPGs these days is companies launching with too few servers for how many people are going to play their game. And then panic adding servers post-launch. And that's something we're seeing with Lost Ark. We saw in New World. I really hope we're not going to get the massive queues, the massive server issues we had in New World. Now, I understand a lot of players do tend to congregate on small servers, but as a company, you should do all in your power to prevent such behavior, locking servers, which, by the way, to be clear, they've actually locked servers pretty quickly and pretty aggressively from what I've seen. But locking servers, creating a lot of new ones, knowing that there's going to be hundreds of thousands, millions of people potentially picking up this game and playing it because of its nature. But yeah, there's some problems with that. And it's not limited to the company making this game. It's an issue with MMORPG developers in general these days, the approach that they've taken to this. And they need to do better. But overall, my impression of Lost Ark is fairly solid. One thing to mention, though, if I had not recorded this video after 14 hours in, if I had recorded it about the 9-10 hour mark, it would have been quite a bit more negative because, yeah, things were pretty tedious and dull. But once you get that awesome content rolling, once you open up the area, things do get more interesting. I guess if you want to have an impression of the game that you develop yourself, if you're willing to do it, play the game in as much as it requires you to get to Lutera Castle, which is about level 30 or so, or 26 to 30, something along those lines. I'm sure you could do it much faster than I have. Get to that point, because that's the point where a lot more things will open up, a lot more systems will open up, and then decide if you're going to continue. That's the best piece of advice I can give people. Costin here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. And stay tuned for more, ladies and gentlemen, because there is more coming, quite a bit more coming.